Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar launching Aldersgate Group's latest report together with IEEP. This report examines the state of the circular economy landscape and the implications for UK businesses. I'm Signe Norberg, I'm Head of External Affairs at Aldersgate Group, and I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by a fantastic cross-economy panel today. You'll hear from Stuart, Anna, Andrew, and Chiara after a brief presentation from Michael. And we're really hoping to delve into the findings of the report, what the implications are from different sectors of the economy, and what then needs to happen for the upcoming strategy, circular economy strategy for England. And we'll make sure to do a Q&A before we wrap up at 1 p.m. today. So make sure you have some thoughts around some questions you might want to ask and put it in the Q&A box below, and we'll try and get to them as soon as possible. And for those of you who don't know us, Aldersgate Group, we're an alliance of major businesses, academic institutions, and civil society organizations. And together we drive action for a competitive and environmental sustainable economy. And we represent major sectors of the economy and also try to bring that cross-economy business voice today. And circular economy has been one of the more fundamental pillars of our work since we were set up 19 years ago now. And we have contributed to policies both at the EU and the UK level. And today's report is essentially the next iteration of that work, working with the IEEP. And we really consider the transition to a circular economy to be crucial for making the best use of scarce resources, strengthening supply chains resilience, and delivering net zero and nature resilience. So we know businesses recognize the opportunities that come with a circular economy, and they're already making the investments accordingly. But we need that policy landscape to really align with those intentions. And that's the kind of scale that we really want to see that alignment across the economy and the policy landscape. And that's where the upcoming strategy is such a crucial opportunity for us to create that level playing field. It'll encourage innovation and help empower businesses and consumers to play their vital part. So today's report looks at exactly the need for us to keep pace with developments that are happening internationally. And to tell us more about this, I'm delighted to hand over first to Michael Nicholson, Head of Policy at IEEP, who will go through the findings of the report for us.
Thank you, Signe, and good morning, everybody. So yes, my name's Michael Nicholson. I'm Head of Environmental Policy at the Institute for European Environmental Policy UK. For those that don't know us, we're a sustainability think tank. We've been around for over 40 years or so. We've got a small team here in the UK and a larger team in Brussels. I'm delighted to be able to present the findings of the report today and also listen to the real circular economy experts, which is Anna, Chiara, Signe, Stuart and Andrew, who will talk more about the real life examples and issues involved in the panel afterwards. The focus of the report is that we've produced, and there should be a link in the chat, is on legislative and policy developments over the last 5 years or so, essentially since Brexit. Next slide, please, Edward. Before I go into the report, though, I'd just like to say a few words in terms of context and sort of take us back a little bit, just to remind everybody that before Brexit, UK circular economy policy was largely determined by the EU. And now much of this is a devolved competence, with each of the 4 nations determining its own laws and policy. And this, of course, has thrown up its own potential challenges around the consistency and compatibility of laws and policies within the UK and between the UK nations. So what has the EU been doing over these last years? Well, the European Green Deal that probably many of you will have heard about neatly dovetails with Brexit, because the Circular Economy Action Plan, which was one aspect that came out of the European Green Deal, has set the EU on a trajectory of of improving and raising the ambition level of various aspects of its circular economy programme. And within this, lots of changes have been made to legislation, existing laws, but also new laws that the EU have put in place. And next year, quarter four, I believe, there will be a proposal very likely on a new Circular Economy Act. And indeed, a public consultation has just opened a few weeks ago, the 1st of August, I think, calling for evidence relating to tackling diverging interpretations of waste legislation, promoting secondary material markets, tackling data gaps and material leakage, particularly relating to critical raw materials. So the EU have been making lots of very ambitious and positive steps, but despite this, there is also growing evidence of at least a slowing down and perhaps a pushback around policy on environment and climate generally across the EU. And circular economy related issues are not immune to this. And this is evidenced by the attacks on the Green Claims Directive proposal, which very recently was effectively shelved by the European Commission. So things are also not rosy on the EU side at the moment. Meanwhile, in the UK over the last 5 years, there's been some progress in developing circular economy policy and legislation, but it's often been in fits and starts. And what we found through doing our work in this project and through this report is that the UK has generally not been keeping pace with the higher levels of ambition being shown by the EU in terms of legislation. And that divergence has opened up on a number of fronts in this policy area. But it is important to say that divergence in legislation is not a problem in itself and of itself. Achieving ambitious policy goals that raise standards and help the economy to grow sustainably are far more important. And divergence in policy and legislation can only really be a problem if it results in a misalignment of rules, which of course then introduce frictions to trade, hampering economic growth and stymieing that progress on environmental protection. For the businesses we've spoken to through this work, the implications of legislative divergence are highly dependent on the location of their operations, their supply chains, and the degree of interoperability of rules. Businesses, of course, seek to avoid costs of operating multiple production lines to service different markets and make their businesses as efficient as possible. And indeed, UK consumers may benefit from products, for example, that are more sustainably made and are of a higher quality being produced in and for the EU market. However, businesses with multinational operations or EU-based supply chains can often be placed at a disadvantage due to a lack of a level playing field, with UK-based competitors servicing only a UK market. And UK-based businesses exporting to the EU may also lack the wider policy support that is available to EU-based businesses to comply with their new EU legislation. But having said all of this, there are some very positive signs here in the UK. The Circular Economy Task Force for England is currently beavering away to produce a new strategy, which we're expecting probably early next year now. A Circular Economy Act in Scotland was published last year, and we're awaiting some associated developments there. And this is, of course, all on the back of strong implementation of rules in Wales, particularly in relation to recycling. So some really positive developments. Next slide, please, Edward. Now, in our report, we look at a number of areas within the larger circular economy ambit. Some we don't look at in as great a detail as perhaps we would have liked, partly because of time and resource. For example, circularity in food systems is perhaps a little light, but what we would do, first of all, is apologise for that, for those that are interested in those issues, but also encourage you to come and speak to IEP and my colleagues at Aldersgate, and let's see how we might work further on that in future. But what I think this does do, though, is underscore the point that Circular economy is a cross-cutting issue. It touches on many areas of government. It's not just a DEFRA issue. It's a Department for Business and Trade, Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, Transport, Health, Housing, Communities, Local Government, Education, not to mention Cabinet and Treasury too. It also underlines the need for the Circular Economy Task Force in particular, and as an example, for the need for them to gain buy-in from those different government departments if circular economy policy is to be objectives are to be successful. And to do all of that while also working hand in hand with devolved administrations around the UK too. This slide is a pretty crude way of categorizing what we would assess to be the main divergence in circular economy legislation since Brexit, but hopefully it provides an easy snapshot, an easy to understand snapshot of that divergence that's opened up in a relatively short period of time. Next slide, please, Edward. So moving into this first real example, eco-design and sustainable products. This is perhaps one of the starkest and clearest areas of EU-UK divergence in policy, and it has significant implications for trade. The UK implemented eco-design rules when it was a member of the EU, but the EU has now gone further by expanding its scope to non-energy related products. It also has a greater focus on durability, reusability and recyclability of goods, for example, and also introduces the concept of a digital product passport for goods. UK businesses selling products in the EU will need to comply with these new regulations if they wish to continue to export to the much larger EU market. And there's also a risk that some non-European producers selling products that do not now meet those EU standards could dump them on the UK market where standards are lower. And as I mentioned a short while ago, there are also some competition concerns whereby businesses selling only to a UK domestic market may have a comparative advantage if product standards are lower. It's also worth noting that the UK government for England previously committed in 2018's waste and resources strategy to match or exceed the new EU eco-design standards, but that hasn't actually materialised. Next slide. On textiles and food, the EU has proposed to amend its Waste Framework Directive. This is a directive that we implemented in the UK through regulations. It's introducing mandatory and harmonised extended producer responsibility schemes for textiles. Several countries in the EU already have EPRs for textiles, though perhaps coordinating and harmonising those will be a key challenge. I'm interested to hear from Stuart in a moment on that. UK efforts to date have largely been voluntary. On food, it's a similar situation. There are targets introduced trying to reduce food waste by 2030, but again, efforts have been largely voluntary. Next slide, please. With regard to buildings, batteries and critical raw materials, first of all, there's revised construction products legislation aiming to further align rules around the marketing of construction products in the EU, and also introducing digital product passports for construction products. This is something that perhaps Anna will speak to shortly. On batteries and critical raw materials, the EU and UK have got somewhat similar policy goals, but the EU have gone further in setting these objectives down in legislation rather than in non-binding, non-legislative documents. Next slide, please. Around plastics and packaging waste, this is an area where perhaps there is general policy alignment, despite the fact that both the EU and UK have made significant changes in these areas over recent years. Single-use plastics, there's alignment between England, Scotland and Wales with the EU. The EU has perhaps gone a little further in addressing oxo-degradable plastics though. Single-use vapes, in the UK, we introduced a ban just a couple of months ago. In the EU, there isn't an EU-wide ban, but several individual countries have got bans. and Northern Ireland, England and Scotland are scheduled to introduce their deposit return schemes in October 2027. Many EU countries have already got these, but the EU has mandated that the rest of those countries introduce them by 2029, unless they've already got high collection rates. And on packaging, broadly similar approaches to packaging and packaging waste, with EPR schemes being introduced across the EU by the end of last year. We've got our EPR scheme charging set to start in October. Implementation, of course, remains key. There's been many challenges around IT systems and costs and so on. So just wrapping up, next slide, please, Edward. We've set down some recommendations as part of our report, firstly for the UK government and the devolved administrations generally, but also with regard to the task force specifically. So first of all, what we'd like to see is greater long-term clarity on the direction of travel and timelines on circular economy policy in the EU. And this will, of course, help the businesses that are working through the Aldersgate Group and so on plan and organise. We'd like to see government clearly setting out how circular economy policy will be embedded across various government strategies. So the industrial strategy and decarbonisation work, food strategy, housing, built environment, and so on. Consistency and interoperability of approaches across and between the UK nations is very important, as is, and I mentioned this before, requiring government departments across Whitehall to work together and with the devolved administration counterparts too. We'd like to see the government and devolved administrations identify areas where divergence negatively impacts businesses trading across the UK and EU borders and ensure these challenges are resolved. Some areas of focus in our report that we've talked about include eco-design, product passporting and carbon taxation. Thirdly, we'd recommend greater sharing of knowledge, data and information on circular economy flows in Europe, but also beyond Europe. And the UK should consider rejoining the European Environment Agency, following the example of other non-EU country members such as Iceland, Norway, Switzerland and Turkey. Next slide, please, Ed. Finally, for the task force specifically, we'd like to see policy and legislative developments in the EU and beyond be a key consideration of any output of the task force. That businesses will need to increase circular economy skills and capabilities across their workforces, so it'd be essential to ensure that government supports businesses in that, perhaps with targeted support to SMEs or embedding training and curricula, embedding circular economy in training and curricula. Policies often linked with innovation and research funds. Horizon Europe comes to mind, so we'd like to see those opportunities for academic and research partnerships promoted too. And finally, very, very quickly, the businesses we've worked with on this have highlighted other issues currently limiting progress with circularity. For example, public procurement, which could better incentivize circular economy actions higher up the waste hierarchy, such as repair and reuse, rather than focusing on interventions around the end of life waste disposal. Okay, that's me, slightly over, Signa. Apologies for that. I'll hand back to you now. Thank you.
Nothing to apologize for. That was very interesting. And before we go on to our wonderful panel, I just wanted to put a question to you that's come through in the Q&A in response to your comment around the different developments on devolved policy on circular economy, where the question around would alignment with the kind of EU circular economy legislation be a decision for the UK government, or would it be something that you would see devolved nations lead on? Thought that would be an interesting point just to maybe pick up, and then I will hand over to Stuart from our panel.
Sorry, was that a question from Michael?
Oh, yes, it was a question from Michael. And then if Stuart, we wouldn't mind coming in and just introducing yourself after that, that would be wonderful.
Okay, so I mean, in terms of that specific point, I mean, of course, it's really important to remember that each of the four nations have competence for this. So it has to be a decision for them. But the point that we're trying to make through our report is that we work together, that there is close coordination and cooperation, and that all four parts of the UK keep an eye on what's going on across Europe and wider world as well, and work together in a consistent way. And perhaps some of our panel members with those real life examples will be able to bring that point out a little more. I mean, we have had some challenges and difficulties already. Deposit return scheme comes to mind, for example. But you know, the important thing is that the four, the UK government and the devolved administrations talk to each other and work together constructively.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael, for picking up that specific question. Now, Stuart, I would love to hear from you and for you to introduce yourself and just set out what circularity means for your business.
Thank you for inviting me. So super interesting report. I'm Stuart Hayward-Heim. I'm the Chief Technical Development and Innovation Officer for Suez in the UK. I'm also the world lead expert on carbon. For my sins, and I must have many of them, I'm also a Circular Economy Task Force member, although today I'm answering as Stu from Suez rather than any other organisation. And I'm also a Sherpa for the Net Zero Council for the waste decarbonisation. So across a lot of activities. So what is Suez? Suez is a waste, resource and water company. I represent the UK business, but we operate in many countries across the world with many different constraints. We have many customers that are domestic and many customers that are international. So we play within all that process. I think the question was, what does circularity mean for our business? I remember doing something with some of my French colleagues in about 2002 that said the circular economy will murder our business. And that's true because we're waste. We are the coal face of the linear economy. We see what everyone throws away. So we've been working as a business since then in our transition. So we moved out of landfill as a decision in 2008, achieved that in 2017. We've been building our recycling, reuse, repair business. And also more fundamentally, we're building a data set that allows us then to help our customers prevent waste. Because if you don't know what you're creating, you don't know where you can prevent it in that process. What does circular economy mean for me? I think the one phrase that delivers the most meaningful is one world living. And we know, you know, we're 2+ world equivalents in this country. Other countries are 4+. Some countries are less than 1. And we should aspire to that. So circular economy is to allow us all, habitats. There's an interesting biodiversity question I've seen come up in the questions. If we use too many resources as a species, then we steal from other people around the world, but we also steal from biodiversity. And if we want to live on the planet that we live on, then circular economy has to do that. And I think the other part is, because it's interesting how people look at it, and the question about devolved authorities, it's an economy, which means it is an economy. We live in a linear economy country at the moment. The circular economy encompasses everything. It's not a change for the waste business or for this sector or for that sector. It's an economy change. And we have to get used to that in our heads, that it's a full economy change.
Thank you. That's a wonderful note to start on. Now, Anna, I would love to bring you in and know what does circularity mean for you and your business?
Good morning, everyone. I'm a sustainability director at Buro Happold. We're an international consultancy of over 3,000 engineers, designers, advisors, and we cover kind of every possible aspect of engineering in the built environment. So how we kind of approach the circular economy at a kind of citywide scale, we're advising city policymakers and our administrators on how to implement the circular economy. And then at a building level, kind of my world, we're helping to engineer buildings that promote circularity. So projects that reuse existing buildings, structures, construction materials, and also that promote the idea of easy reuse in the future through sort of designing for disassembly, material passports, etc. And I think just putting a bit of a plug for just how dreadful the construction sector is. You know, the UK built environment is responsible for over 60% of waste in the UK and 50% of material use. So it does really feel that there's this massive opportunity actually but also acknowledging just how complex construction is. So yeah, morning.
What a challenge to highlight, and it will be wonderful to unpick that a bit more as we go through the session today. Next, I wanted to bring Andrew in from Co-op. It will be wonderful to hear about what does circularity mean to you?
Wonderful, thanks again. Morning all, and I want to start by thanking Michael and the team for a really interesting and helpful report. It's a real pleasure and privilege to be discussing it here. So I'm Andrew, I'm Head of Public Affairs at Co-op Group. Co-op's the world's oldest, the UK's largest consumer cooperative, owned by our 6 million plus members. We're a major food retailer. We've got more than 2,400 shops of our own, but we're also a major food wholesaler, so we service supply into another 5,000 independent convenience stores through NISA, our wholesale arm, and into another 1,300 independent Co-op Society stores as well. We're also, I should say, the UK's largest providers of funeral care. We have an online legal services business and we sell insurance. All of that, though, entirely UK based. Supply chains, of course, will reach well into the EU and beyond. What does circularity mean to us? I suppose fundamentally, it's just one part of the efforts that we're going to reduce our environmental impact as a business and to help our members and our customers to be reducing their impact on the planet as well. It's something that consistently packaging at least, which is, I guess, where our principal interest is in food and drink packaging. It's something that members and customers, whenever we poll them, whenever we want to speak with them about what matters to them, it is something that comes through really loudly and clearly, and that's why we've had a real focus on it in recent years. Reducing unnecessary packaging, increasing recyclability. I'm sure we'll end up talking reuse as well, coming down the line as well. So that's where we come at this from.
Thank you. That's great. And last but certainly not least, Chiara, would you like to set out what circularity means for you?
Yes, thank you very much. And first of all, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Chiara Antonelli, Head of Climate and Circular Economy Policy at IEEP, IEEP EU branch, of course. And well, about circular economy, so based also on what EEA, the European Environment Agency, says, a circular economy is a system that shifts away from linear production and consumption towards more circular processes and circular models. So this entails two very important things. So the fact that, of course, this relates to expanding activities, not only what we usually see, which is usually related to circular economy as recycling, but also that there's an entire whole ladder of circularity, which we usually do not recognize as much as we should, especially in policies, but also as common awareness, like rethinking, reusing, refurbishing, remanufacturing, etc. And secondly, the thing is to consider is that circularity really means really improve also our well-being, not only from a firm's perspective, but also consumers' perspective. So circularity really helps and supports living well within planetary boundaries. And as such, circularity practices and models should not only be tailored, or let's say should not only be addressed to firms, but also consumers have responsibility to actually understand and being able to be part of these circularity processes.
Wonderful. And having set out what circularity means for each of you, and I love the kind of varying perspectives that we have, I really was hoping that we could also unpick a little bit on what is it that we need to do to unlock further action in this area. And I was thinking maybe, Andrew, from your perspective, that means a lot with engaging your supply chains and having those kind of conversations. I was wondering if maybe you wanted to pick up on that and what you think are the kind of crucial next steps from your perspective.
Absolutely. I guess that the three things that spring immediately to mind. I think that for those of us in the retail space, it's a real privilege because you're at that intersection between the supply chain, the producers, the manufacturers, and your customers. We think a lot about our members as well, but customers more broadly. So we've got lots to do in both directions in terms of the specifications and the standards that we set, and there's a particular opportunity for us around our own brand packaging. We've moved to 100% recyclability of that packaging back in 2021. That involved rolling out a soft plastics recycling scheme to enable us to make that claim. So in that direction, absolutely loads we can do in the own brand space, and loads of great innovation happening in the branded space, of course, as well. Shouldn't discredit that, but we've got less control over it. So we've got to think about it in that way, and we've really got to think about for consumers, and I'll probably chat about food waste a bit later on. But there is such a massive behaviour change shift that is needed in the household. So we think quite carefully about the role that we can play in the comms that we do, the ways that we engage with customers as well, and then I guess. If I'm thinking about our business operations right across the UK, what does it take to unlock further action? And Michael's already addressed the question of competence. There's a real tension for us as a co-op. Democracy is one of our 7 principles. It's a really important value of ours. However, if we want to see consistent action and for industry to really pick up the charge, that consistency across the 4 nations in the UK in ambition and in policy timelines is just so key, and there are loads of examples where that applies right across the piece, not just in the waste space. But we've already had the first mention of DRS. I'll make the second one. It's something I spend a lot of time thinking about how we really turbocharge action in that space, and that has been a real barrier and continues to be certainly a worry. So 3 things for us supply chain members, and then thinking about how we get to a point of greater alignment to enable industry to really step up as efficiently as possible.
And I was wondering, Stuart, if maybe you want to come in on that point as well, because I think also just looking at that point around consistency around the 4 nations, but also I mean, Andrew brought up packaging, that kind of end of life perspective. What do you think is kind of needed to really accelerate action in this space?
So I think exploring not only with packaging, and packaging's been on a journey of developing better data as part of the EPR, and you really want that better data when you're designing the policy rather than when you've partway through the design process. So I think good data leads to great knowledge, and great knowledge leads to good design, I think, in that process. So I think gathering data, and certainly we've seen that in some of the circular economy task force work, that there's data missing in parts, and therefore it's quite difficult to go and find it. We're supplying data as a company to Scotland to help with some of their work that's unique to how we collect data in Suez. So I think good data, great knowledge, and as Andrew, who's fairly vertically integrated in the retail space, is the collaboration. I think, and Andrew mentioned flexibles. We've been part of the collaboration group that's been working on the Flex Collect trial, as how to collect flexibles from local authorities, which is 20 brands, waste organisations, local authorities, all working together to get to common result. And I think that's what we need to get across many parts of the sector, in the basis of we're all in it together, and that includes government. I think one of the learnings I had on the first session of the task force was a statement that came out of Treasury, which is very much what we do as a business, is every transition has to be affordable. So whatever we do, in terms of all the goals we pick and other bits and bobs, we have to design transitions that are deliverable and affordable. And to do that, there's lots of different things we need to kind of put in place on that. But to design them, you need that good data, great knowledge, to actually get affordable. So there's no point going bust before we get to the end. And that's as much a rule for us in business as it is a rule for government as well. Government has to manage the finances of the country to get to an end point. And there's a very good tension in that, of making sure that we all consider what we want to get to, but also how we get there and how we transition and how the sector and all the stakeholders within the sector go. And that comes back to that data, knowledge and collaboration part.
Wonderfully succinct. And I think, Anna, you set out very much what the challenge is on the kind of construction side. And what do you think is the kind of crucial next bit that will unlock action in your sector, given the mountain, so to speak, to climb?
Yeah, so we've seen a real impact of kind of reuse targets on design and construction. So with kind of central London, Westminster particularly leading the charge. But we need to embed these across the UK. And we kind of need policies really to cover every aspect of the construction sector. So we would be looking for very strong pro-retrofit policies, like the optioning policies brought in the City of London, also VAT changes. We would like to see a kind of development of a market for reuse, so very onerous embodied carbon reuse targets really help that. We'd like to sort of ensure that contractors are helped with the logistics and complexity of the circular economy. So that means kind of material and repurposing hubs located within city boundaries, really good material exchange platforms, and policies that really help reduce the length and complexity of supply chains, and critically to increase their transparency. And then finally, kind of help for manufacturers. So really incentivizing take-back schemes, investment in material research, skills training. So yeah, quite a lot there. But I think it really needs to be approached at every point, really, in the kind of construction cycle.
And kind of part as a wide package is really what I'm hearing, that it needs to have that kind of holistic systems perspective as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, Kira, anything from your perspective that you think would really help really accelerate action in this area?
Thanks. Well, my perspective is more a policy perspective, I would say. So not a lot into the business per se. But in any case, I would say that there is still, at least what we can see here at EU level, there is still quite some action to do in order to harmonize policies more and more. So we will discuss it later on, of course, but harmonization is still much needed among the member states. And this is crucial also for businesses to give clear information, but also market access to businesses and to make a business case exactly for circularity processes. Otherwise, there would be no economic convenience, unfortunately, to not too much, at least, to include it in specific businesses, I would say. But I also agree with what Stuart said before, that, and this helps both for businesses and policy per se, is the importance of gathering data and information. So some of them are already there, so it will be quite straightforward. Some others that would require additional efforts and steps, of course, but that is a much needed investment in order to better control, increase transparency, also create market opportunity as well, and improve policies, that's for sure. So, many things have already been discussed by the fellow panelists, but I say these are the main key points I would like to make for now.
That's very helpful. And yeah, it aligns very well with the points that Andrew was making as well about that kind of synergy and ensuring consistency. And I think that that's also another bit that really stands out from our discussion so far. And looking at the upcoming, and I think this is probably a question for kind of Andrew and Stuart and potentially Michael as well, but looking at the upcoming economy strategy for England specifically, what is it that you want that strategy to really hone in on? Drawing on the comments you've already made, what do you think will be the kind of critical bit that you'll be looking out for in that strategy? Maybe starting with Michael this time.
Well, I mean, I think those skills and capabilities point is a big one. You know, it's a societal shift and change, and embedding that knowledge and information, and you know, changing our perception and understanding is really important. So building, that's a long-term project, but building that through our skills and capabilities is a really big one. And then, of course, because I work for IEEP and we're a European-wide organization, we really care about understanding learning from other places. So and trying to get that learning in, and also putting that learning back. So So that's also a really big part for me, and that was one of the key recommendations in the presentation that we put in there.
Maybe Anna or Andrew, would one of you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I said, it's definitely the lessons and good practice from London to extend across the UK. And I think it really means embedding in policy a completely different approach to setting a brief for building, designing and then constructing, and then operating and maintaining that asset. It's a whole different approach, and I think really worth pointing out that where a lot of these policies are strong, all the policies that have been discussed in relation to products, construction is way more complex, because while the products might be fantastic, well designed, environmentally friendly, what happens when they come to site is that they get locked together with adhesives, plasters, God knows what, and it all becomes a little more complicated. You can't repair a window if you can't get it out the building. So, you know, it's sort of all these, it needs to really cover the complexity of all sectors.
So no silver bullets then. Oh, goodness.
I know,
Yeah, I was
sorry.
hoping we would get one. Stuart, in terms of that complexity and also being on that kind of receiving end on a lot of those challenging products, what's your perspective? And speaking as Stu, obviously.
Yeah. That's fine. I think there's been a few questions through. I think there's a few things that have been really good at the task force. If I just answer on a personal basis, I've 30 plus years in our sector, and it's the first time I've sat with all the departments. So there's a common ambition that's been elucidated to us. So I think that's a good one. I think on a product by product, there's lots of complex stuff. We're doing a lot of work on carbon fiber, and carbon fiber's brilliance is its ability to be bespoke designed, which is great, but then to unpick it, I often use the frame stop sign, it's throwing needles into my haystack, because it's really hard to pick them out again. So what you then have to do is work out whether there is commonality in family. So you have to get over that IP issue around, well, it's my IP, not my, and I don't want to share it, to give us enough information to create a family solution. Because a single bespoke hunt my needle solution is very expensive, but if you can get families, you can start to get economies of scale. And if you look at the battery point, we have a battery recycling facility ourselves. Getting the metal bits out of the battery, fine. The black mass is more of a metallurgical process. Metallurgical processes are work at scale. So where can you get enough black mass in one place, process it in an economic way, thus that the salt's going to be extracted for the purposes of making new batteries, for example, that competes with the linear economy in the sense of where that is. And when we will have that, because we've got obviously batteries in the system at the moment, but they come back in a phased manner. We're getting some of the hybrid batteries back now, because they were the first cars released into the marketplace. We get lots of scooter batteries and bike batteries back because people will break them and then they can't be repaired. But the car batteries are emerging, but they're not there yet, and we're still converting our fleet to electric. So actually we're in this really complicated transition where we've got more coming to market but not coming off. Then you've got secondary use where they're being used for battery storage, some of the car batteries. So where does that sit in that chain? So I think coming back to the complex, you have to have, which is why I think the task force is split into groups. I've done a huge amount of learning in fashion. Those who know me know that I'm no fashion icon, but I've done a lot of learning in fashion in that process. And there are really complex points. I've seen a couple of comments on behaviours, and just understanding emotional durabilities in fashion has been a fascinating process. But you have to understand that to understand and engage with the sector and understand their feedback. And I think just in comment, what do I want to see out of the task force is an interesting one. I'd probably say to reflect the ambition of the sectors that we're talking to. The textile sector have huge ambitions, and I hope that we can match those ambitions in a transitional, affordable, transitional way.
Andrew, any thoughts from your perspective?
Yeah, I guess just two quick ones to build on everything that's gone before. And Stuart, really encouraging to hear about that cross-government approach being taken, because that would have been the first thing that I'd have said. It's always easy for businesses to ask for that. I think we've got to remember how hard that is actually for government to deliver on. So we should applaud it where it's happening. That does need extending out in an ideal world to the devolved administration. So we have seen in this space that the four nations can work quite closely. Again, suspect that is easier for us to ask for than it is for them to actually deliver. And then secondly, I think a real focus, and Stuart, you had some wise words on this already, I think a real focus on implementation. What are those really clear outcomes for each of the sectors? What are the realistic milestones that we're going to try and work together? How will engagement with business happen to enable that delivery continue beyond this initial phase of work? And that point about implementation is so key, because there are some really big step changes in consumer behaviour that are going to need to come. All our experience to date suggests that neither government nor industry can drive that kind of consumer behaviour by themselves. So I guess that's perhaps slightly less easy for businesses to ask for, because we've got to be ready to step up to that dialogue and that joint working. Again, we've seen plenty of examples where it's not all that easy for government to facilitate it and do it properly either. So yeah, this would be my just two thoughts there.
Brilliant, thank you. And we're getting so many questions in the Q&A. Please, everyone, feel free to keep it coming. I promise we're going to get to a part where we're going to bring in your questions as well. But I think just before we do that, I really wanted to know, building on a similar theme, I suppose you can say, is if you could essentially see one thing or really advocate for one thing to be delivered by 2030, what would it be? And you've mentioned some of the themes, but if there's a particular policy that you'd be particularly keen on seeing, or upcoming strategy that can really help build that link to circularity, what would that be, given the range of change that we have? And Chiara, I would also love to hear from your policy perspective as well on the EU, like if there's something you want to see that really helps to nail that down, would be really fascinating. And then I'll promise, we have had so many good questions in the Q&A, so I'll start bringing them in as well.
So that's me, right?
Yes,
Okay.
if you wouldn't mind starting, and then I would love others' perspectives as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. So, well, what is mostly expected by everybody, and it's been expected for quite some time, there's been a lot of excitement / anxiety over the last year, was about the Circular Economy Act. So we do expect the Circular Economy Act to be tabled at the end of 2026, ideally Q4. And so that actually should, theoretically, that in theory, that should give quite a boost to our circularity policies. I mean, the EU is a global leader, in fact, in advancing circular economy policies, but a lot can be done yet. And the Circular Economy Act is, or could be, an act that could harmonize even further and accelerate that circularity across all member states. So this comes with a single market for secondary raw materials, something that we've been expected for quite some time. And if we want to read it in the competitiveness key, that is also key to competitiveness. And this also brings more harmonization and work in through the life cycle assessment, and especially if we look at EPR, but also bringing in more seriously the digital product passports, or creating stricter obligation for sustainable product design. So we already had the Eco-Design Forum, well, the SPR, and then the Eco-Design Forum that lay out the first plan, which brings the first, let's say, products that will be under this eco-design new rules. But the idea is here to really see how this can be deployed more consistently. And the Circular Economy Act is something that we are very much expecting, especially because we know that we don't have, well, there's no compulsory targets right now. We don't have, well, our circular material use rate is very low, and resources are key for competitiveness, which is one of the key pillars for the clean industrial deal. So circular economy is key for the past, but also for the coming, well, the current mandate. So we really want to see this happening. We want to see the Circular Economy Act to be a solid file, let's say, legislative file, and really to contribute to a shift that will harmonize also regulations and legislation across member states, also in order to give market opportunities to businesses per se.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Chiara. Anna, 2030. What are your thoughts?
2030, well, we've already enacted all these incredible policies and the world is a very different place. But I think what would be really fantastic, not so much on the policy side, but if the government could truly understand the impact on, we haven't talked about jobs, we haven't talked about, but you know, in certainly in my world, in the construction industry, the more we implement a circular economy, the greater number of UK jobs in the construction industry. And I just think that that's just got to be communicated far better so that people understand the real, and of course, it was mentioned by yourself, I believe, earlier, the essential link between the circular economy and then the kind of prevention of loss of biodiversity and the kind of environmental destruction around the globe. These are all such critical connected issues, and the circular economy has such a wide impact. And so I suppose I want to see, yeah, all these great policies, but a full appreciation of the benefit of a circular economy.
That is wonderful.
Small thing.
Yeah, no big ask. Stuart or Andrew, would one of you like to come in? And then otherwise I am itching to get into the Q&A.
So I'll jump in really quickly, and then I'm sure Stuart's got one thing, although you did establish already that there's no silver bullet here. I think by 2030, there's going to be a huge amount in our space that will have been implemented, right? I think we've got to keep in view the amount, even before the Circular Economy Task Force concludes its work and leads to whichever policies it leads to. I think it's important that is something that we do recognise. If there's one area where I would love to see progress that has proven really challenging so far, it's around prevention of food waste. I checked just before we got together this morning. RAP's latest data is still showing 10.2 million tonnes of food wasted. It's near on a quarter of all food. I was trying to come up with some smart way of conceptualising it. It's one of those figures that many of us on the call, I suspect, will be really familiar with because it's so often quoted. It's a quarter of every shopping trolley. It's a quarter of what's in every single time you load up your fridge, right? Like it's just staggering. And there is such a opportunity there to align so many different kind of policy outcomes. To put it in a really dry way, wins for households, wins for business, wins for the economy, wins for the planet. That for me just feels like an area that absolutely needs to be a focus for us all.
Wonderful. We will be picking up some of that in a moment, I'm sure, because I think it ties in very well with some of the behaviour change questions that have come through. But first, Stuart.
So just for me, just to kind of add to the excellent comments that have been made already, I think for me, I'd like to see every major sector on its transition. Now, some of that will be regulated and some of that may be voluntary at the moment. There's no reason why a sector can't start pulling their data together. There's quite good evidence elsewhere that people have done that. And when you start pulling the data together, you start seeing easy wins, quick wins. And then they can be done without waiting for policy, because it's always difficult to get policy aligned and done and through the consultation process, and all the checks and balances need to happen in government to make that work. So I think there is, if every sector had started its journey, even if it's a voluntary journey, to collect the right data and start to understand how it works and how all its influences are, because that then means you've got a start for 10 when government does come knocking on the door and go, okay, how do you transit? You've got, here government, we have a plan, here's the data, here's the plan, this is what we think we can do, and this is what we can do it by. I think government would be far happier if sectors came up with their own plans. Others, you know, on a personal basis, I'd like to see the task force really gathering steam and delivering lots of stuff, and expanding its role. But yeah, I think it's a super good.
It goes to the implementation point, I think, that was made earlier by Andrew as well. And turning to some of the really excellent questions that we've had, I wanted to start off with an easy one. So Sue has asked in the chat, she has asked 2 questions that I kind of want to put together to you, and whoever wants to answer that, feel free to jump in. But is essentially the circular economy in conflict with a growth economy and more aligned to a no growth approach? Would love to hear your thoughts on that. But similarly as well, Sue asked a question around the kind of essentially, I think the challenge around cross departmental buy-in for this agenda as well. I think that they kind of go a little bit hand in hand given the current political context. So would love some perspectives on that. Who would like to start? Stu.
I'll go for Stu from Suez. I don't think it is. I think the problem we've had, and we've had quite a lot of discussions in our stakeholder sessions, and we've been through it at Suez in terms of what does this mean for us. If you look through the transition, you're changing traditional measures of the process, how many units I've sold, to almost value. We've been kind of looking at kind of total cost of ownership. So if we can get total cost of ownership down, then you'll have more loyal customers. And there's a whole thing in for packaging is, you know, reusables. It's a very different market. You have to supply it differently, getting refillables and reusables into the marketplace. Getting the repair market and resale market in textiles working, and we've had some really interesting feedback from platform providers where people are selling on those platforms where people are buying stuff with the intention to resell it, and they're buying quality because they know they can resell it at a better value. Then you start to get, and I've seen lots of questions on behaviours, you start to get the behaviours changing because actually my total cost of ownership, if I buy something for £400 but could sell it for £300, it's only cost me £100, but I get something of quality for that. Whereas if I buy something for £100, I get it at maybe a quarter of the quality. And there's quite a lot of that behaviour change, I think, to come in through that process. So I don't believe a circular economy is uneconomic. There are some real challenges, level playing field, not only domestically but internationally. In terms of how do you compete, how do you create barriers of trade liquidity but not trade barrier, I think is a real challenge between the different trading blocks in the world, EU being one of those. And we talk about alignment with the EU, but in textiles, a lot of our inbound textiles don't come from European providers. They do in certain classes, but not everywhere. And our sales of exports aren't all going to the EU either. So there's a very delicate balance in trying to work out how to fettle this into the system. But no, I believe when you change one economic model to another, there's a very well-known white good provider who seems to make more money from components and services than they do from selling new items, and it's that model that we have to adapt. It's different in fast-moving retail than it is from bigger items, and that's where that data, that knowledge, the skill base of the sectors in that transition is really important in designing something that works, takes people along. I'm going to do something in packaging because it resonated with me when we did the original work. We talk about we must improve recycling, and we go back, well, what does that mean? So we broke it down to what we call the 590s. So to get roughly 60% recycled, what do you need? You need about 100% of the material placed on the market to be recycled. You need 90% of people doing 90% of the right thing 90% of the time to get the material in the right bin. Then you need less than 10% losses in the sorting and 10% losses in the recycling to get 60%. If you fail in the first 3, i.e. 90% of people 90% of the time, then you never get enough to do it. And that's where the system comes in. You've got to have the system working together, and 90% conformancy on those 3 performance levels. It's a really tough target. We're about 70% at the moment. And that's where actually the system has to work, not just one part of the system. You can't ask a brand, a retailer, the consumer to do something on their own. They're all part of the system. There's a really interesting question on, is it demand-led or is it marketing-led in that process? We've had lots of dialogue around that, and I think the answer is somewhere in between. It's partly demand-led, partly marketing-led, and marketing's part of business. We market. So in that sense, you can't get away from that. It's about how do you change that tune. So there's a long answer to the short question.
No, I loved it, and I will want to pick up also, I think, the behavior change I mentioned earlier, but I think also particularly would love to get your perspective on local authorities as well when we get through to that bit, because I think also the dialogue with local authorities and the public and behavior change is really interesting. But before I do, I thought, Anna, you might have some thoughts on the kind of no growth or kind of growth approach. I think particularly given your mention earlier around jobs, I thought that might be one you want to pick up.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking conceptually, I can't see, certainly in my world, how a really thriving circular economy could be sort of counter to whether it's growth or just a kind of successful construction sector, because it's efficient use of resources. So I can't, you know, and you're not chucking away things, you're just reusing. So it doesn't strike me that means that's it's I would have thought a good economic model, not the opposite. And I mentioned jobs, but yeah, absolutely, you know, retrofit uses 3 times more people than new build, for example, on site. You know, you've got a lot more reuse, repurposing of materials, and that all takes labor. So I can't see that there would be a link at all.
And I think, Chiara, looking at the EU level as well, I think that we've kind of seen that kind of been part of the kind of economic package, almost the economic rationale that the EU set forward, in terms of the kind of circularity being that corner piece that Michael mentioned earlier. Was there anything you wanted to come in on that? Otherwise, I'm keen to get to behavior change next, which I can see there's lots of questions on. Oh, you're on mute, Chiara.
Yes, apologies. So if this is still related to also the question of growth, and this is something that I was also looking at before with quite some interest. So this is a very interesting point to make, especially because we also had the Beyond Growth conference, and we had a whole discussion of Beyond Growth economy for quite some time in the EU as well. And circular economy has also been analyzed a couple of years ago as well with a waste management firm. But circular economy, that also implies a specific part of the beyond growth, and that is efficiency. And there's also connected to what Stuart was saying before, so where the responsibility, let's say, or where the efforts should come also from a market, from supply side and demand side, and this is in between, in both. So sufficiency also means enough. So living well within planetary boundaries also means being able to really implement sufficiency, and this also comes from a demand side. So I must say that this, so the EU right now has focused on circularity as one of the pillars of the Clean Industrial Deal, as I said before, which should be, as actually the Green Deal was also a growth deal, a growth system, let's say. But in any case, there's no competitiveness, and there's no competitiveness, and there's no growth, if you want to say it this way, if you don't have resources, if you don't have the right amount of resources and the good resource use. So that is not sustainable if we go beyond the planetary boundaries.
No, thank you. That is wonderful. And I think we had a question as well on the chat around the kind of planetary boundaries question, actually, that might be worth bringing up before we talk about behavior change, which is just around footprinting and whether or not that can, but maybe it can make circularity more connected to the impacts from choices and decisions. What does the panel think about this as a narrative, essentially? Would anyone like to pick that up?
Happy to go first. I think footprinting is an essential component, but I think we're in danger of not doing anything while we wait for the footprinting to happen. I think there's lots of early easy wins that we can get on with, the obvious stuff, whilst we do some of the more complex stuff. Footprinting, boundaries, life cycles, the number of debates that sit in the marketplace about where to draw the boundary. And I think that they're wonderfully and worthwhile academic arguments, but if they delay us getting on doing stuff, in the built environment, they get on and, you know, mean that we're still discussing the life cycle of reusing an I-beam, when actually we can get on and use the I-beam with a few easy changes and maybe just industry standards rather than regulations. So we don't always have to go to regulation. We can go to whatever tools necessary to get that moving. I think that's better. So it's all part of the picture, but I think we should be wary of putting too many technical, academic, policy, whatever challenges you want to do in front of starting, because the sooner we start, if we can get 60 odd million people doing something good today that saves a kilo, then that's 66 million times kilos that we've saved tomorrow, and then they can do another kilo tomorrow. And I think we have to have a blend of small quick actions, because we can see the frustration with power prices, for example. We're in a transition from fossil fuel to non-fossil fuel and economy, but in that process there are costs flowing through that doesn't make it cheaper for the public, when logically in their heads they think it should be. If we lose the public's confidence, then we lose the system, because we need everybody to come with us. And I think therefore, whatever happens in business or citizen, you need to see some early wins and some easy wins, and then you can see that the change is worthwhile and is going to benefit everybody. If we all bank it in the future, we won't do anything in the short term, and when we do get there, we may have lost the public, or it may be too late, and too late is also a question we need to deal with.
Wonderful.
If I may, Signa,
Yes.
I think just building on that, it struck me from what Stuart was talking about, linked to footprinting, and talked about planetary boundaries right in his first intervention, and he's also mentioned data and information. And I think one of the things is that we often mistake perfect as being the enemy of the good, and you know, it gets in the way of us actually just making some progress. Even limited small steps is progress. And yes, it's not perfect, it's not great, it's not where we want to be, but we have to be making progress, a little bit of progress. And I think we also need to communicate, be good at communicating with the public, that is not the ultimate objective, that's not where we want to be, but at least it's something, you know, and we need to just get on with it. And so, you know, talking about rather theoretical academic issues like that, I think sometimes gets in the way of us, you know, making some, you know, rather limited progress. And that's the thing that frustrates me, certainly from where I sit.
Can I just add in on the footprinting? I think, you know, data is obviously great, but I totally agree with what you guys have just said. I think it's also just being really clear about what you are measuring. So if we just, for example, put carbon lens on decisions, well, that will give us an answer that has a carbon lens on decisions. So for example, you know, if you're looking at construction materials, if you don't think about embodied environmental impacts, you're not really making the right decision, because we're just thinking about, say, operational energy or embodied carbon. So I think it's all being really clear about what we are measuring and why.
A very good point. And I think we kind of talked a little bit about the conversation with the public, and I wanted to start that conversation around behavior change. And I thought, Andrew, what is your perspective, kind of being on that almost kind of quite direct sort of intersect between kind of the public, your work as a business, but then also government? There's some questions in the Q&A also about whether or not, if it is government and business and kind of the role with the public, where do you sit on this topic?
So it's everyone, right? I think
Yes.
I think if we're going to talk about behaviour change, I think we've got to be really clear that business and government have got a huge role to play, and just kind of carrying the strand of the conversation, absolutely 100% behind not making the perfect the enemy of the good, but at some point, and clearly in this space, given everything we know about planetary boundaries, we do need government to come in and level the playing field through regulation, because industry-wide monitoring initiatives in this space have achieved a huge amount, but will only go so far. So I wouldn't want to underestimate the role of businesses. But I guess I was just, in reflecting on just the importance of the role of the consumer and consumer behaviour change, even thinking something as simple as the deposit return scheme that will be coming in across England, Scotland and Northern Ireland, at least by 2027, and probably Wales too. even just in something as simple as drinks container recycling, that will require a consumer behaviour change shift if that scheme is to be as successful as we certainly hope it will be, because instead of recycling at curbside, to get that scheme up and running and to get your deposit back, consumers will need to take their bottles back to reverse vending machines in retail outlets. So there is real change coming, and real change will be needed. I think in terms of how do we look at this, we think there's a real need to see ourselves as citizens in the food system rather than just consumers, and really participating and being really conscious and mindful of the decisions we take, and be involved fundamentally and engaged in a way that many consumers aren't. And there are lots of good reasons for that, right? People are busy, they have lots of pressures. They're probably not thinking about the waste system as much as we are. But what we fundamentally need to do is close the gap between people's intent and what they say they're going to do, and then what they actually do, and to make that much easier for them.
If I may, just on that point about DRS, one of the things that I picked up when I was sort of looking into that issue, and Andrew, you obviously know a lot more than I do on this, but across Europe, there's many countries that already have very successful schemes. This is not something that's new, and there is lots of learning out there. Germany and Sweden, for example, have very high rates already and quite successful schemes. And so whatever learning we can get, just to bring it in and help us, we really ought to be using those good examples and also learning where it doesn't work quite so well as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. And Stuart, I think here it's also quite interesting in terms of the work that you're doing at Suez with local authorities as well. And I think that they also play quite a critical role. And there's some questions as well about what can particularly local authority policymakers do to support the transition as well. Would love your perspective on that, but also kind of the behavior change element.
So I think in terms of local authorities, I think they have more influence than sometimes they think. That they are the host of the businesses that operate in their area, and there is a link. They get business rates from them, but they also service the consumers, the citizens, and everything else that goes with that. So there's quite a lot of linkage, and we can see that. I think I've been involved with, I'm very privileged to be involved with, for a good couple of years now, the One World Living programme in London, which was really a bottom-up approach. It was kind of going, what do we know as local authorities? It's local authority kind of coordinated. What do we know? What's good practice? Can we take that good practice and can we help it replicate itself? Can we join people up and have a network so that actually they can learn from each other about what they did and didn't work on, what they did and did work in that process? And that's had picked its topics and worked on it. Food waste was one, electrics was another. As a key thing of empowering the local authorities not to wait for something, but to actually go, well, this is good. It's good for the community. They get good feedback from the community. It supports local action in communities. And as they join together, the fact that they bring scale by aggregation is important. And no, absolutely agree with Andrew that regulation does set the level playing field, and voluntary can only work within a certain area. Regulation does need to happen to set the boundaries, but they were doing a lot already, but they weren't talking to each other, and then they got together, and then suddenly they were talking to each other, and then suddenly it was like, oh, well, you've done this, or well, we could do that. And we see the same with business. We'll have businesses where taking the food waste, we've worked with a hotel chain where a number of the chefs in there had a really excellent way of managing how much food they produced. Was it a whole pile of waste engineers coming along? They'd cook appropriately, they'd measure the returns, they'd kind of work out how to proportion next time, if it's software engineers, if it's whoever in that process. And they were using all that data to understand what to cook, how much to cook. They were measuring what's coming back, and they were adjusting what they were doing, and they were really minimizing that sort of buffet not eaten component of hosting events at hotels. That was driven by some motivated people taking some data, and all we did with the organization is help them realize that these people existed and they could copy and paste it to all their other hotels. and suddenly they've made a saving in what they've wasted, they've made a saving in what they're buying in that process. And that's what I mean about quick wins. There's lots of stuff, and I think local authorities are, I think, the most trusted part of any government. Local government is more trusted than central government in that basis, and therefore they hold a position where they have more influence, more trust, and more local feel. So I think there's a lot they can do. And if I come back to kind of one of the key principles of circularity is collaboration, and they are a really good linkage between the citizen because they host the citizen, the business because they host the business, and they are a link to the central government, and they can pass information back to central government. And I think actually they can play a super important role, maybe confidence, and if they wanted to, I'm sure the One Wood Living group would be quite happy to share some of their learnings from the 2 years they've been in place.
That's wonderful and very thoughtful answer. So thank you for that. Anna, there's a specific question in the chat around, unless you want to come in on behavior change, but I was really interested in a question in the chat about planning and whether or not if it's not catching up to construction in terms of requiring reuse and rejecting demolition and rebuild in inappropriate situations. So structures that can be retrofitted and reused, to what extent do you think that that's the case?
Yeah, I mean, I might actually link the two questions. For absolutely sure, planning departments could have enormous influence here. And I mentioned Westminster Council, but they've really implemented some very ambitious reuse targets, and it's had an enormous impact. But if the planning department essentially adopted a kind of reuse hierarchy, prioritizing retention, many are, but really adopted properly across the UK, that would have an enormous impact. So 100% planning department can look at this. But I think in relation a bit more to the last point, planning departments are also in a really unique position to look at the planning of the entire area. And we've got to think that materials flowing in a very different way, in a circular way, actually needs quite a lot of space. We're retaining material, whether it's food, construction materials, whatever. So actually our cities and our towns need to be planned in a slightly different way because the flows of materials are now doing different things. And I think, as a result, local authorities can really ensure that they're leading the way in providing that circular infrastructure.
And I think it's a very good point in terms of the space, because I think also in the wider sustainability agenda, we've seen a lot of debate around land use and making sure that we maximize that. So that's also an important consideration. Is there anything any of the other panelists wanted to pick up on this topic and kind of behavior change, role of local authorities? No, other than I really wanted to turn to this question that Julie's put in the chat around the kind of ask that you had, Michael, around developing a shared vision to help the circular economy progress. And do we think that there is enough of a shared vision across the EU to deliver that systems change? Maybe one actually to start with Chiara for this one.
I'm sorry, can you repeat again the question from
whether or not if there's enough of a holistic vision within the EU to accelerate progress? Do you see that at the EU level? You kind of mentioned already previously the role of kind of member states and harmonizing that. It would just be interesting to pick that up a little bit further.
Well, in terms of a holistic process, I think the European Union is trying to go towards that direction, of course, because as you've seen, and as Michael has also mentioned in the report he produced, there's a plethora actually of policies that have been going on and on for quite a while on different topics regarding circularity, but circularity and circular economy, as you know, covers so many topics and so many sectors at the same time, and it spans towards from economics to chemistry as well. So the point here is that you really need to, there's no other way, but if you really want to have a circular economy, you need to go towards and work towards a holistic approach. I think we're going towards the right direction, and the Circular Economy Act might be an encouraging step. Depends, of course, on how this will evolve in the coming year, of course. But more efforts are needed for sure. And as I said before, harmonization on having targets, gathering data, enough data, and qualitatively sufficient data at least is a necessary step. So we definitely should aim for a holistic approach for circular economy to be real.
Thank you. That's great. Stuart.
I think there is a vision, but then the vision has to have tangible things that people understand. And I think one of the problems we have in our sector, but also I think in many of the policies, is a tons-based mentality. And the report pulls this out. You know, if I ask people how many kilograms of textiles they've got in their wardrobe, they'll look at me weirdly and kind of go, "You what?" If I go, "How many jumpers you've got? How many shirts you've got?" And if we want behavior change, if we want citizens, if we want employees, employers to come on board, we have to talk in their language, not in our language. And therefore, talking tons, and I have this discussion with DEFRA and the devolved authorities around measuring stuff. We measure reuse in tons. So I go, okay, I've done 4,000 tons of reuse, and a company that manages 10 million tons a year doesn't sound a lot. When you go, oh, we've reused 1 million items, and we've given I can't remember, X number of thousand children the opportunity to have a bike, and Y number of people to cycle to work and retain a job, which is more engaging? I've got 4,000 tons of this, or is it the fact I've helped all these people be empowered and change their lives? And I think we have to take from the brand and the branding point of view the storytelling that comes with some of the circular economy, and how that works. You know, I was stealing from the bees is something that I've used since COP26, I think. You know, everything we do where we consume more than we're allowed to consume on a worldly basis, we're stealing from the bees, and we know the bees are essential to our future. So how much are you willing to steal from the bees and stuff for them? And you need to create these emotive links to get to people to understand why, what they can do, what they can do today, drive less, walk to the shops. There's a whole pile of different things. Recognizing the fact if you can come back with 5 bags of shopping, you probably won't want to walk to the shops. But if you're just popping out for a bottle of milk, you probably can. And those things really, why is it important to me? But it's important to me because I recognize that each time I do this, I'm leaving something else for somebody else or something else, the bees and the biodiversity. So we do need to wean ourselves off this kind of policy metric that talks in language that isn't the language of the people that we're trying to influence. Sorry, I'll get off my hobby horse now, Stu.
No, I think that's really interesting, and I'm conscious of time, but you did mention bees, and we have talked a little bit here and there about food waste and environmental impact. And I just wanted to see, before I ask each and every one of you, as a little bit of a heads up on what your key takeaway from today's discussion's been, I would love to hear if there are any reflections also on the question of bees and biodiversity that you wanted to pick up on that. So maybe, Stuart, it's a chance to get back on the hobby horse very briefly. But also if any of the other speakers want to come back on the kind of biodiversity front, please do.
Yeah, I think people are waking up to nature. I think weirdly COVID introduced people back because that was their freedom, was generally walking in parks or walking in the country or whatever. In that process, super empowered by the ambition of the governments on biodiversity. So it's worried in the UK about some of the small development proposals. I'm not sure that you can die by multiple small pricks as well as you can die by one swing of a sword in that process. But circular economy, a sustainable circular economy is exactly that. It means that you have to balance all your resource consumption against, which is why I come back to my first point, that one world living is the way that I communicate circular economy, because circular economy to the public is some inane concept that none of us does. In fact, I'll probably, if I asked the circular economy task force members, we'd all have slightly different versions of what we believe to be a circular economy. But fundamentally, we're trying to protect the planet, we're trying to live within that, but also try and do that in a clever way so that we're not impairing our life choices too much, but we are reducing our consumption, and we are then stealing from other people and stealing from the bees in that process. So I think biodiversity is a fundamental part of the outcomes, and we need to make sure that we don't take shortcuts that damage biodiversity, because biodiversity doesn't often return in shortcut ways, as we know from trying to get to re-biodiversize this country.
Yes, no, very, very wise. And since we're speaking, what would be your main takeaway from today's discussion? And then I would love to go to Michael, Andrew, Chiara, and Anna in that order. So if you wanted to start, Stuart, your kind of key takeaway.
Key takeaway for me, start now. And if you've got the right data and you know what you want, make sure that the people that are making choices know what you want, and you provide the data to support what you want. And I think that's certainly what we've seen with the Circular Economy Task Force. Everyone's really keen to get on and have been gathering data in different formats, not always in the right places, not everything that you ideally want, but I think we can get on. So start now on things you can get going, and then work with government and work with whoever else to kind of deliver it. The policy isn't done in isolation. Policy is done with the sectors and with the people and other bits and bobs. It should be a collaborative process. So probably collaboration, one takeaway. I'll stop talking now.
Oh, that's lovely. Michael.
Yeah, it's Stuart's last point that's going to lead me on to mine, I think, because I come from the north of England, pretty much as the salt of the earth part of England, even though my accent probably doesn't betray that. But I think Stuart's point about communicating in a language that people understand is really important. Is that it's the way in which we can translate those big concepts, the big policy objectives into, actions that people can take. I think that's really the key thing, and people are willing to change and will change as long as they understand what it is you're talking about, and I know that from, walking into pubs and cafes and shops in where I grew up, they just would look blank at you if you talked about those issues that Stuart's talked about. So that's really the key, and the key message that I'm going to take away from today.
Andrew, and then Chiara. Yeah,
thanks. So look, I think I've been really reminded of the breadth and the complexity of the circular economy agenda, and I guess encouraged by the sense that breadth and complexity actually presents itself as an opportunity if we choose to take it. So for me, it's that opportunity for us to all play a part in a really positive sense that is the key thing that I will take away.
Chiara.
Thanks. And I also want to connect to what Michael said, and that means that social acceptability is also key in order to have successful policies, especially circular economy / sustainability policies. But also the fact that we need to do more to do harmonization. So harmonization is key as well, within the EU, within the UK, and also between the two of us.
And last but not least, Anna.
I think, it's struck me how different all kind of sectors are, which is really interesting. But I think that the important thing is perhaps that we deal with the detail of the plastic bags and the plastic packaging, but we absolutely maintain the overarching concept of the circular economy, and that would guide all the decision making and policy.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I really enjoyed each and every one of your takeaways. I think my takeaway from the discussion today is that the moment to really accelerate action is now. I think that there's so many opportunities ahead. The ambition is there, but we really need to start connecting a lot of dots together to do that. And I think that kind of picks up on the implementation side as well, which we've talked about today. I wanted to extend a thank you to the whole panel for joining us today and sharing your perspectives, but also all of you who've been in the audience contributing with all of your excellent questions. I'm sorry we couldn't pick up all of them, But if there are other things you want to pick up on the back of the report, which you can find a link in the chat, please feel free to get in touch either with us at Aldersgate or with the IEEP team who have worked really hard on this report. So thank you so much for joining us today, and yeah, looking forward to continuing this very vital subject in the months to come. Thank you so much.